Hi guys, just wanted to give you a budget build for BLAIR. So I'm going to give you sort of two builds. One will be for your general content, your farming, that sort of thing, and then one will be for your bossing, your sort of inset boss battles. And so neither build will require catalysts or activators. The idea is to sort of give you a good build to let you play the character, sort of feel like the character, and then decide if you want to then invest further with, you know, activators, catalysts, things like that, because you don't always want to just sort of jump into it since you are one of the more valuable items in the game. So the idea of the farming build is you're primarily going to be using your first ability. So if you've used Valby, it's going to be similar to that. You're going to be using your first ability to leave behind the flame zones, and it will work like Valby's puddles basically, in that the enemies will spawn on it and sort of die before they can really move or anything like that. And then in between using your first ability, you'll be sort of using your third and fourth ability. So in terms of the mods, first is the submodule. As always, you can use pretty much any submodule you like as long as you make sure it is max upgraded so that you're getting those 10 extra mod slots. In my case, I've used mid-air maneuvering. That's just my preferred submodule. If you want something a little bit cheaper, then you can use realistically any of the blue submodules. Again, just make sure they're max leveled so that you're not missing out on any mod slots. So since this is a farming build, you don't need a massive amount of survivability, but you do want some, and so you're going to want HP amplification. Now you could swap this out for increased HP if you don't have HP amplification built up, although I would advise just building up HP amplification. It's such a all-round good mod that you can use on pretty much any build, and you will want both HP amplification and increased HP for the boss, so you may as well build it up for the farming build anyway. Next is skill extension, and really the main reason is to keep your flame zones up for longer. It just increases it from 12 seconds to 16.4, and so it just means you don't have to use your first ability as much because it's going to be there longer anyway. And so the next two are focus on dimension and focus on fire, and you can see I've left focus on fire unleveled, whereas I've maxed focus on dimension. And so the reason for that is focus on dimension gives you skill power modifier, whereas focus on fire just gives you flat out sort of skill power. With Blair's ability, since this whole build revolves around his one primarily for the farming, you can see his base skill power for his first ability is 31.6%, and really as a general rule of thumb, if your ability is under 100% sort of base damage, you're going to want to use skill power modifier rather than flat skill power. It just gives you more value from doing it that way, and so that's why I've gone for focus on dimension maxed out instead of focus on fire. Now I have still gone focus on fire as the second mod because it makes use of the pre-install catalyst slot for one, and for only 3 mod slots you're getting an extra 6.1 cooldown, and the fire skill power does still benefit all your abilities, especially when it comes to something like the fourth ability, which has quite a high base damage of 407%, so you can't really go wrong with it for only 3 mod slots. And then last is skill expansion. It makes use of the pre-installed mod slot, but also having that extra range is going to make a massive difference when it comes to, again, your first ability. More range just means it's going to be hitting more of the mobs, and so you're going to be farming much easier. So moving on to the bossing build, this revolves really around the backdraft transcendent mod, and so I'll quickly show you sort of how that works and how you're going to want to use it in the inset boss battles. So what this does is it changes your second ability for one, and what it will do is when you use your second ability, it gives you increased weak point damage based on the amount of flame zones, and it also increases your firearm attack. And so just to show you that in practice, and so you can see here my firearm attack is about 46,700 and my weak point is 1.3. And so if we spam out all my flame zones,
It's cooking time.
and if we pull them back in,
Looks like we're done.
and we check again, so my firearm attack's gone up quite a bit, about 6,000, and my weak point damage has gone up by about 0.3, so a nice sort of increase there. And this also changes your passive so that it no longer gives you the increased skill power, it instead gives you increased crit hit damage and crit hit rate. So part of it is you're going to want to keep the enemy on fire with burn damage, that way you get the increased crit hit damage, and then you're also going to be wanting to keep as many flame zones on the ground as possible to increase your crit hit rate. And so flame zones are created again by your first but also your fourth ability. So just to show you that in practice, my crit hit rate with all the fire up is 94.72%, and then with no flame zones it's 74%, so quite a nice increase, getting me very close to that 100% mark. And then to show you the increased crit hit damage from shooting an enemy that's set on fire, so by default I'm getting about 481k, and then when they're set on fire I'm getting about 500k. So all these buffs sort of add up to make your gun much stronger, and so you're going to be wanting to cycle through them during the boss fight. And so what you're going to want to do when it comes to the inset boss battles, you're going to want to try to keep the boss on fire as much as possible. So you're going to want to put down your first ability, you're going to want to put it back in, and then you're going to want to spam out as many of your flame zones as possible, so something like this. and then that way you're going to have as many of your buffs up as possible, and you'll pretty much just cycle that throughout the whole fight, keeping up your flame zones but also making sure to use your second ability when you can so that you keep up your weak point damage and firearm attack as well. Now, whilst you're primarily going to be using your first and fourth ability to keep the boss on fire, you can also use a weapon to do that. So as an example, Enduring Legacy, I've got fire attack as one of the rolled stats here, but you could also use a mod on your gun, so something like fire enhancement. You sort of have multiple options in terms of keeping the boss on fire. So in terms of the other mods for the bossing build, submodule, same again, just use whatever you got built up. You're going to want to have both HP amplification and increase HP for survivability, because again, this is for your bossing build. You need more survivability than you do for your farming build. You're also going to want to have time disruption. This sort of works perfectly because it gives you a nice amount of HP, but also gives you some extra skill cooldown for you to be able to spam out your first, second and fourth ability to keep the flame zones up, to keep the buffs up from your backdraft mod. Focus on fire, again, only 3 mod slots and you get a nice little bit of cooldown. And then skill expansion, this allows your flame zones to stay up longer, so allows you to be keeping up with your buffs for longer, but it also allows your second ability to last for longer. So you can see here it goes from 20 seconds to 27.3 seconds that you're keeping that firearm attack and weak point damage up from using your second ability. Now, in terms of the weapons, I would suggest for the builds, when it comes to farming, you can really use whatever gun you've got built up already. You can never go wrong with something like the Thunder Cage because it doesn't really require much investment for farming, and you pretty much get given it for free, so you can't go wrong there. Now, in terms of bossing, I don't like to give a best in slot weapon when it comes to the budget builds, so I'd say just use whatever gun you've got built up the most. You can't really go wrong with something like an Enduring Legacy because it synergizes with fire. A lot of you probably have Greg's Fate built up, since that seems to be one of the strongest weapons at the moment. Really, you can't go wrong because this build buffs up your weak point and your crit, so whatever gun you've got built up will work. Now, in terms of the reactor, you're going to want a burning phase reactor, and so that's a fire skill and dimension skill. In terms of the stats that you're going to want on it, the best stats are going to be things like duration up and range. That's going to really work with both your bossing build and your farming build, but you can't go wrong with something like cost, cooldown, dimension skill, fire skill. So you have quite a few options that you could go for. Now, in terms of external components, similar to the guns, I don't like to suggest a best in slot because it would defeat the purpose of a budget build if you then had to go out and spend hours and hours and hours farming the best in slot external components. And so what I'd say is just go for a tanky set, so things like HP and defense on your external components. So yeah, I hope that helps. Thanks.